The death and burial of Mary I. It could be argued that Queen Mary I's demise was a consequence of profound emotional anguish, although medical assessments suggest that ovarian cancer was the true cause. Her life was marked by persistent sorrow and disappointment. Mary's early years were characterized by the affection of her father, who regarded her as the treasured pearl of his realm. However, her idyllic childhood came crashing down with the arrival of Anne Boleyn, which led to her father's pursuit of an annulment from her mother. Mary staunchly opposed her father's divorce and his rejection of papal authority, believing that this rejection equated to a denial of her Catholic faith. She could not accept the idea that her parents had never been married, viewing it as a lie that would condemn her soul. As a result, she was cast out of court, separated from her beloved mother Catherine, and denied the opportunity to see her, even in her final days. Eventually, Mary succumbed to her father's relentless pressure, but their relationship was irrevocably altered. When Mary ascended the throne, she viewed it as an opportunity to restore the England of her childhood, a kingdom of enchantment and prosperity. She hoped her marriage would mirror the happiness that she had once observed in her parents' union, before Henry had seduced by Anne. In fact, she had romantic notions about her husband before they even met, envisioning a return to Catholicism that she believed the English people would eagerly embrace. However, her expectations were met with deep disappointment. By 1558, Mary had become a shell of her former self. Abandoned by her indifferent husband after 2 failed pregnancies, she was bewildered by the persistence of heresy she had fought so valiantly to eradicate. Ironically, a woman who revered the martyrs of faith failed to recognize why executing heretics did not yield the desired results. As she lay in her deathbed at St. James's Palace, silence enveloped her, her court having deserted her in favour of her sister Elizabeth, who was destined to become the next queen. This abandonment left a lasting impression on Elizabeth, who would later hesitate to name an heir, recalling how the court had turned its back on Mary in her final moments. With her strength waning, Mary's hours became increasingly filled with sleep and her clarity faded. Yet she managed to draft her will, and ultimately she could not bring herself to name Elizabeth as her successor, stating only that the throne should pass according to the law. Some speculate that she died of tympany, while others attributed her death to the heavy sighs of her sorrowful heart. Her council, noticing her sighs and eager to offer comfort, feared that she mourned her husband's absence. When asked about her distress, she replied, "That may be one cause, but it's not the greatest wound that pierced my oppressed mind," though she withheld the specifics. Mary had offered a lady's pious advice and envisioned angelic children frolicking around her, singing joyfully. Mary's illness prompted a nationwide sense of mourning, yet she bore it all with remarkable patience. She reassured those who grieved, sharing her dreams of angelic children and encouraging them to maintain a holy fear of God, which would protect them from evil and temptation. She urged them to understand that whatever befalls them is by divine permission, instilling confidence that God would ultimately turn it to good. Throughout her life, Mary endured constant trials, experiencing little joy, and save for her efforts to restore Catholicism to her realm. During her brief reign, she faced numerous conspiracies against her, fueled by malice towards God's truth. She commanded her council and servants to remain steadfast in the Catholic faith, and with her final moments spent in prayer, listening to spiritual lessons, and receiving the sacraments of the Church, she departed this world on the 17th of November, 1558. On the morning of her passing, she attended Mass in her chamber, a daily ritual that she never missed, even as death approached. Despite her condition, she participated with fervour and devotion, responding attentively to the priest's words. When the priest proclaimed the Agnus Dei, She clearly and reverently answered each invocation. As the priest prepared to consume the sacred host, she adored it with reverence, closing her eyes, and peacefully surrendered her soul to God. According to the Duchess, who recounted this moment with tears in her eyes, the last vision Mary experienced was of her Saviour, ensuring her a blessed transition to his heavenly presence. In reality, the last moments of Mary I were far from the grandeur one might imagine. She received her final rites just before midnight on the 16th of November 1558, and the last Mass was held in her chamber at dawn the following morning. After this, Mary slipped into eternal sleep, passing away sometime between 5 and 7 a.m. According to one account, her death was so serene that it went unnoticed for some time, leaving the exact moment shrouded in ambiguity. Once the news of her passing broke, the few remaining courtiers rushed to be the first to inform Elizabeth. Sir Nicholas Throgmorton, in his haste, removed a ring from Mary's finger. Reports vary on whether it was her coronation or betrothal ring, and presented it to Elizabeth as proof of the Queen's demise. However, he was disheartened to learn that the council had already conveyed the news, making his efforts redundant. Mary's body was entrusted to her local attendants, who prepared her for burial in a manner consistent with the practices of the time. As undertakers were not yet common in Tudor England, her physicians and household officers took on the solemn task of embalming her, providing their final service to the Queen, and unlike her mother, Catherine of Aragon, who had been embalmed by her chandler, Mary's own team carried out the procedure. Her surgeons carefully disemboweled her, removing her heart and lungs. The clerk of the spicery and the chandlers filled the cavity with spices and herbs before wrapping her body in cerecloth, a wax-coated fabric used for burial shrouds. Mary was buried in a nun's habit, though given her strong attachment to her husband, this seems very unlikely. The cloth-wrapped body was then enclosed in lead sheets by the sergeant plumber before being placed in a coffin covered in purple velvet and adorned with lace and gilded nails, an arrangement that Mary would have favoured. Following the customary practices of the time, her removed organs were interred separately. Mary's heart was stored in a silver casket lined with velvet and buried in the Chapel Royal of St. James's, while her entrails are thought to have been laid to rest at Westminster Abbey. In 1670, during the funeral ceremonies for General Monk, a royal vault was opened, revealing two urns, one belonging to Queen Mary and the other to Queen Elizabeth. Upon examination, Busby noted that the contents of Mary's urn resembled a red substance akin to mortar, but with less moisture than that of Elizabeth's. For over 20 days, Mary lay in state at St. James's Palace, surrounded by flickering candles, and Elizabeth ordered that the highest honours be given to her sister, mirroring the funeral rites conducted for their father, though with a significant difference. Mary's ceremonies were conducted entirely within the Catholic tradition, and her ladies maintained a constant vigil, praying at her coffin and offering masses for her soul. The funeral commenced on the 13th of December, with Mary's coffin adorned and placed upon the elaborately decorated hearse drawn to Westminster Abbey. A wooden effigy dressed in one of Mary's gowns and holding a sceptre, while wearing a crown, rested atop the coffin. Due to the rudimentary nature of embalming at the time, the effigy took centre stage throughout the month-long funeral, necessitating a lifelike representation. Elizabeth spared no expense in decorating the chapel for the service. The chapel was draped in black cloth, the altar was embellished with purple velvet, and a canopy of the same material was suspended above it. A hearse, square and surrounded by 46 massive candles, weighing 20 pounds each, was beautifully crafted with crowns and roses. Below the candles, a valance made of sarcenet bore Mary's name in gold letters, surrounded by a golden fringe. Within this valance, another layer of buckram with black silk fringe provided further decoration. The hearse was lavishly decorated with various symbols, and beneath it lay a taffeta majesty with gilded dome and the 4 evangelists positioned at each corner. The railings around the hearse were lined with broad black cloth, and the ground beneath was similarly draped. 15 stools covered in fine black cloth stood around the hearse, with purple velvet cushions atop each. An altar was positioned to the left of the choir, draped in purple velvet and adorned with church ornaments. As the chapel was meticulously prepared, the sergeant of the vestry was instructed to guard it until the royal corpse was brought down. Some accounts suggest that Elizabeth hinted at her displeasure if the court failed to attend Mary's funeral, leading to a grand procession that featured the highest nobles in the land. The Bishop of Worcester, accompanied by other bishops and the Queen's Chapel, moved to retrieve Mary I's body. While the chapel remained in the great chamber, the bishops entered the chamber housing the deceased. They censed the body and recited various prayers before it was lifted by 8 gentlemen. The procession was arranged in a solemn order, a cross followed by white branches carried by boys in surplices, then the chapel members, and finally the gentlemen, squires and chaplains of lower rank. Officers with torches lined the sides as the procession made its way. Then the overseers, earls, executors, and kings of arms. The body itself was covered by a pall of gold tissue, with a matching crown placed at its side. 2 noblemen, including the Marquis of Winchester and the Earl of Westmoreland, touched the body, while a canopy of purple velvet, supported by 6 gentlemen, sheltered it. The chief mourner, Lady Margaret, Countess of Lennox, was accompanied by the Earl of Huntingdon and Viscount Montague, with her train carried by Lady Catherine Hastings and the Vice-Chamberlain. Behind her followed 14 additional mourners, paired off, and then the other ladies and gentlemen, concluding with the guards. The funeral services were as elaborate and drawn out as customary for Tudor royals. At last, after the extensive ceremonies, Mary was laid to rest in the chapel built by her grandfather, Henry VII. The body was carried to the designated chapel for burial, where the Archbishop and other bishops conducted the final rites. As prayers were offered, 4 gentlemen, ushers, removed the pall from the body, which was then lowered into the grave, with the Archbishop casting soil upon it. Noblemen, including the Lord Treasurer and the Lord Chamberlain, broke their staffs over their heads and tossed the pieces into the grave as a mark of respect. Once the burial was completed, the Archbishop and bishops disrobed from the ceremonial vestments. Following the burial, the noblemen and prelates gathered, joined by the officers of arms. Garter, the principal king of arms, along with 2 bishops, announced the new queen, proclaiming, "Of the most high, most puissant, and most excellent Princess Elizabeth, by the grace of God, Queen of England and Ireland. Defender of the faith, God save the Queen Elizabeth." The noblemen raised their hands and caps in salute as trumpets sounded from the road loft. After this declaration, the attendees departed to the abbot's house for dinner. The extravagant ceremony cost over £7,662, a staggering sum, equivalent to millions today. Elizabeth insisted on this elaborate display, as any slight to a Tudor monarch would also reflect poorly on her own reign. Meanwhile, Mary's widowed husband, Philip II of Spain, expressed his sorrow in a letter to his aunt. He wrote to the Queen, "My wife is dead. May God have received her in his glory. I felt a reasonable regret for her death. I shall miss her even on this account." He instructed his representative in England to attend the funeral, ensure the collection of his jewels left behind during his last visit. Among these was La Peregrina, the famous pearl that he had given Mary on their wedding day, which would later gain fame as part of Elizabeth Taylor's estate. In her will, Mary requested that her mother, Catherine of Aragon, be exhumed from her modest tomb in Peterborough Cathedral and reinterred alongside her, with a proper monument to honour both. Despite this heartfelt wish, Mary had not taken steps during her 5-year reign to arrange for her mother's burial to be upgraded from that of a dowager princess. Could she truly have expected Elizabeth to grant Catherine the honours of a queen, given that Elizabeth's own legitimacy hinged on Catherine's denouncement. Ultimately, the tomb was never built, but that should not be taken too seriously. Elizabeth appeared to avoid creating tombs altogether. She never honoured Anne Boleyn with a proper marker for her unmarked grave beneath St. Peter ad Vicula, nor did she construct a monument for her father or her brother. Even Elizabeth herself did not have a tomb built until James I took charge after her death. Mary's grave remained unmarked for nearly 50 years, and accounts indicate that rubble from altars destroyed during the Reformation was piled atop her resting place. Upon Elizabeth's death, she was temporarily interred alongside her grandfather, Henry VII, until James could complete her grand tomb. Once finished in 1606, James exhumed Mary and placed her alongside Elizabeth. The tomb bears Elizabeth's carved marble effigy with her achievements inscribed in Latin along the sides. However, an inscription on the lower portion acknowledges Mary's presence. Partners in throne and grave, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters in the hope of resurrection. Both coffins were interred in the same vault beneath the chapel floor, with Elizabeth's coffin resting atop Mary's, once more placing Mary in a subordinate position to her half-sister. The historical memorials of Westminster Abbey recount that Elizabeth and Mary's tomb was opened once during the search for James I's remains. The excavations revealed 2 coffins within a narrow vault beneath Elizabeth's monument. It was evident that these contained both Elizabeth and Mary. The upper coffin, larger and shaped more distinctly like a body, was reminiscent of Queen Mary of Scots' resting place. Despite some decay, the area revealed the Tudor badge, a double rose, along with the initials ER and the date 1603 inscribed on the lid. This intimate vault, containing the 2 Tudor sisters, partners in life and death, was a striking contrast to the chaotic decay found in the Stuart vault nearby. Their resting place, serene and dignified, provided a stark reminder of the tumultuous legacy they shared. May they rest in peace while we walk the generations around their strife and courage under these restless skies. Death of Queen Elizabeth I. The iconic monarch of the Elizabethan era became the epitome of beauty standards during the 16th century. Her pale and flawless complexion was revered as a symbol of nobility and perfection, setting the benchmark for feminine allure. However, this ideal of beauty came at a grave cost. Elizabeth's pursuit of perfection led her to the use of cosmetics containing toxic substances such as lead and mercury, which not only harmed her skin, but potentially contributed to her eventual demise. One of the most prominent cosmetics that she used was a makeup composed of lead and vinegar, which she applied to her face and neck, resulting in a ghostly appearance that became her signature look. Furthermore, Elizabeth adorned her lips with a stain, which was made from a mineral containing mercury, giving her the iconic red lips depicted in numerous portraits. Over time, the prolonged use of these toxic substances caused irreversible damage to her skin. The lead corroded her complexion, while mercury poisoning led to symptoms such as memory loss and depression. Despite being aware of the risks, Elizabeth persisted in wearing her makeup for extended periods of time, exacerbating the harm inflicted upon her skin. Even the process of removing her makeup posed further dangers, potentially exposing her to additional mercury. The tragic consequences of Elizabeth's pursuit of beauty are underscored by the accounts of individuals who praise the effectiveness of mercury-based makeup removers, unaware of the harm that they were causing. These removers, while leaving the skin feeling soft, were actually stripping away layers of tissue, causing significant damage. Additionally, Elizabeth's early years were marred by a battle with smallpox, which left her with permanent scars on her face. In a society where appearance was heavily scrutinized, Elizabeth went to great lengths to conceal her blemishes, fearing that they would diminish her stature as a ruler. Throughout her life, Elizabeth employed various strategies to maintain her image of youthful perfection. She prohibited unflattering portraits of herself and relied on skilled artists to depict her in a flawless manner, as evidenced by the famous Darnley portrait. However, the realities of aging proved inevitable, with Elizabeth resorting to wearing wigs to conceal her thinning hair. Despite her efforts, the Earl of Essex's revelation of her balding head in 1599 served as a stark reminder of the passage of time. In her final months, Elizabeth's health declined rapidly, yet she adamantly refused to rest, fearing it would signify her demise. Instead, she endured standing for long hours, supported by pillows strategically placed by her attendants. On the 24th of March 1603, Queen Elizabeth I passed away, with potential causes of death including cancer or pneumonia, exacerbated by years of exposure to toxic cosmetics. The aftermath of her death was marked by speculation and controversy, with accounts of her body allegedly bursting open in her coffin due to the buildup of noxious vapours. While the exact cause of Elizabeth's death remains uncertain, her tragic fate serves as a poignant reminder of the dangers inherent in the pursuit of beauty. The use of toxic cosmetics dates back centuries, with evidence from ancient civilizations like the Romans, yet their poisonous nature was not officially recognized until after Elizabeth's death. Despite advancements in understanding the risks associated with certain beauty practices, the quest for beauty at any cost persists to this day. The story of Queen Elizabeth I's beauty regime serves as a cautionary tale, highlighting the enduring legacy of pain and sacrifice in the name of beauty throughout human history. The funeral of Queen Elizabeth I. Queen Elizabeth I, one of the most iconic figures in British history, left behind a legacy that has intrigued and inspired generations. Her passing marked the end of an era, and her funeral was a spectacle that drew masses of all walks of life, reflecting her impact on her subjects and the wider world. On the 28th of April, a little over a month after her death, Elizabeth I's final journey through the streets of London to Westminster Abbey was not just a procession, but a vivid tableau of the era she dominated. The events of that day and the subsequent handling of her resting place weave a fascinating narrative about royalty, remembrance, and the respect accorded to one of England's most formidable rulers. Elizabeth I's funeral took place on the 28th of April, a little over a month after she died. Her body was carried through King Street, now called Whitehall, in a large parade all the way through to Westminster Abbey, where she was buried. Hundreds of people joined the procession, ranging from ordinary men and women to trumpeters, Elizabeth's household staff, knights and nobles. The Lady Marquis of Northampton led the procession as the chief mourner. Westminster was packed with people everywhere, on the streets, in houses, and even on rooftops. Everyone came to watch the funeral, and there was a lot of crying and sadness, unlike anything people had seen before. One of the interesting things about the funeral was the drawings that showed what the procession looked like. There was a model of the Queen, dressed in her official robes, complete with a crown and sceptre, resting on her coffin. The coffin was draped in purple velvet and pulled by 4 black-dressed horses. Above the coffin, a canopy was held up, and noblemen carried 12 banners around it, representing the symbols of the House of York, but not those of the House of Lancaster. Elizabeth I died and was buried with much ceremony. Her funeral service was led by Dean Andrews, and she was initially laid to rest in a vault with her grandparents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, at Henry VII's chapel. But in 1607 her remains were moved to be with her half-sister Mary, marking the unusual case of a Protestant princess buried next to her Catholic sister. This move cost 46 shillings and 4 pence, according to Westminster Abbey's records. Elizabeth's successor, King James I, spent quite a lot, about £1,485, more than a nobleman's yearly income, on a white marble monument for her. Interestingly, this monument was smaller than the one he later made for his own mother, Mary, Queen of Scots. Originally, the statue on Elizabeth's monument was painted in vibrant colours, and even the lions at its corners were gilded, though no colour remains today. There's more to discover about Elizabeth's resting place thanks to Arthur Stanley from the 1880s. He was allowed by Queen Victoria to examine all the tombs in the Abbey, a place usually closed to the public. Stanley's exploration revealed insights into the hidden crypts, including the one of the Tudor tombs. In his search, Stanley found a narrow vault with 2 coffins stacked, one on top of the other. He described Elizabeth's coffin in detail. It was well preserved, decorated with a Tudor rose, her initials ER, and the year 1603. The coffin was crafted from oak and elm, and parts of its red silk velvet covering still clung to the wood. This find is a unique glimpse into the final resting place of Elizabeth I, lying directly above her sister Mary. It's a remarkable story that sheds light on the hidden history beneath Westminster Abbey. Thanks to the efforts of Queen Victoria and Mr. Stanley, this adventure into the past is just the beginning, as there are more secrets to uncover about the royal burials in future explorations. The grandeur and solemnity of Queen Elizabeth I's funeral procession, her burial, and the subsequent discovery of her final resting place offer a window into the rituals and reverence of royal funerals. The touching story of her reburial alongside her half-sister Mary I and the creation of a monument in her memory highlights the complex relationships and political dynamics of the Tudor period. Thanks to historical accounts and the diligent work of historians, we gain a deeper understanding of the significance of these events. These explorations into the past not only honour Queen Elizabeth I's memory, but also enrich our understanding of the cultural and historical context of her reign. As we continue to uncover details about the royal burials at Westminster Abbey, each discovery adds a new layer to the rich tapestry of British history. The tragic death of Henry VIII's first son. Henry, Duke of Cornwall, was born on the 1st of January 1511 and was the firstborn son of King Henry VIII of England and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. His arrival was initially met with grand celebrations, as he was the prospective heir to the throne. However, he passed away just a few weeks later, and the inability of Henry VIII and Catherine to have another surviving son precipitated issues of succession and marital disputes. These conflicts eventually strained the ties between the Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church, ultimately contributing to the onset of the English Reformation. Henry VIII is remembered in history as one of the most ruthless and brutal kings of England. He would do anything to get what he wanted, especially his desire for a male heir. This led him to execute his second wife, Anne Boleyn. However, Henry did have a son before all his marriage troubles started. His first marriage to Catherine of Aragon was initially happy, and Catherine gave birth to a son. If this son had lived, history might have been less brutal, and Henry might not have ended up marrying 6 times. Catherine was first married to Henry's brother Arthur, but she loved Henry, her second husband. Her early pregnancy went well, and following tradition she was confined to a room for the last part of her pregnancy, attended only by women who would help deliver the baby. Childbirth was very dangerous at the time, but Henry and Catherine's early marriage was fruitful and happy. In November 1510, while Catherine was pregnant, Henry VIII participated in a tournament, impressing her with his fitness and organising a grand event with music and dancing to entertain her. Before Christmas that year, Catherine attended Mass with her court and then hosted a lavish banquet. Soon after, she retired to her quarters for the childbirth confinement, during which no men, including Henry, were allowed in. Catherine's chambers were well prepared with beautiful tapestries and paintings to create a positive atmosphere. A font from Canterbury Cathedral was brought in case the baby needed a quick baptism, and on New Year's Day 1511, Catherine gave birth to a son, fulfilling Henry's great desire for a male heir who he hoped would succeed him and continue the Tudor dynasty. For many years to come, people hoped that Henry VIII's son would have many children and keep the Tudor family ruling England. But when the prince was born, London celebrated in a big way. There were bonfires, and the mayor gave out free wine to everyone in the city. Next to the Tower of London, cannons fired to celebrate, and the midwife who delivered the baby received a large reward. Catherine of Aragon must have been very pleased with herself, because she had successfully given the King of England a male heir. She watched her ladies wash and wrap the baby, who was then placed in a big cradle. Catherine rested in bed and welcomed guests, including her very happy husband, Henry VIII. About 30 to 40 days later, Catherine went back to her usual royal duties, and the baby was named Henry after his father and grandfather. They hoped that one day he would become King Henry IX. When Prince Henry was just 5 days old, he was baptized at the Church of the Observant Friars next to where he was born in Richmond Palace. Important people from the court and ambassadors watched the ceremony. The baby was named the Duke of Cornwall, and his godparents were the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Earl of Surrey, and the Earl and Countess of Devon. Celebrations spread across Europe, with the King of France sending gifts and ambassadors from Spain, where Catherine was originally from, bringing good wishes and congratulations. After her rest, Queen Catherine rejoined King Henry, and they went to Westminster Palace. Meanwhile, their son, Prince Henry, the Duke of Cornwall, stayed in the royal nursery under the care of his nurses, though his parents often visited him. King Henry then organised another tournament to celebrate his son's birth on the 12th of February 1511. He challenged men to beat him in the tilt-yard, and the event was filled with grand displays, celebrating the court's wealth and the king's happiness. The Queen and her ladies watched from a special enclosure decorated in gold and purple velvet, featuring the initials of Henry and Catherine. That evening, another big party and banquet took place, marking one of the happiest times in Henry and Catherine's marriage. But the joy didn't last. Although plans were made to name Prince Henry as the Prince of Wales, a tragedy struck 52 days after his birth. The young prince died in the royal nursery at Richmond Palace. The exact cause of his death is unknown, but it was common during the Tudor period for children to die young, possibly from something like sudden infant death syndrome. Queen Catherine and King Henry VIII were devastated. A funeral was held for the prince at Westminster Abbey. At the time, the etiquette determined that the king and queen did not attend the funeral in person, so they relied on trusted courtiers to perform the ceremony for them. His small coffin was carried from Richmond Palace down the River Thames on royal barges draped in black. The procession was a sombre event, and everyone wore black. The coffin, carried by 6 knights, was escorted into the abbey by monks after a short ceremony, and Prince Henry was buried near the chapel of Edward the Confessor. This tragedy deeply affected English history. Catherine and Henry tried to have more children, but Catherine faced more tragedies with childbirth. This led Henry to seek other relationships, such as with Anne Boleyn, who later gave birth to Mary I, known as Bloody Mary. When the new high altar was being constructed in the 1860s, a small lead coffin of a child was found in the northern part of the step in front of it. This may have been the young Henry's coffin, but it was not disturbed, and there is no marker. Henry VIII's complex personal life would lead England through a time of executions, religious turmoil, and brutality. The death of Prince Henry was one of the most tragic events in King Henry VIII's life, and the grand celebrations after his birth had shown great hopes for his future, but these were dashed with the death in the nursery. Thank you for watching. Please leave your comments below. Tragic death of King Edward VI. Edward VI was born on the 12th of October 1537 and became the King of England and Ireland on the 28th of January 1547. He was only 9 years old when he became king, and he ruled until he died in 1553. Edward was the only son of King Henry VIII and his third wife, Jane Seymour. He was the first king to be raised as a Protestant. Because Edward was so young, he didn't rule the country himself. Instead, a group of advisers called a Regency Council made all of the decisions. His uncle, Edward Seymour, led the council first, followed by John Dudley. Edward's time as king had a lot of problems. There was an economic trouble and social unrest, which led to riots and rebellions in 1549. He was also fought a costly war with Scotland that didn't end very well, resulting in England pulling back its troops in exchange for peace. During his reign, the Church of England became more clearly Protestant, a change that Edward supported. This was a big shift because his father had kept many Catholic practices, even though he broke away from the Roman Catholic Church. When Edward was 15, he became very sick. Knowing he was dying, he made a plan for who would follow him as ruler to make sure that England stayed Protestant. He chose his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, to be the next ruler, skipping over his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth. After Edward died, there was a dispute over who should be queen. Jane became queen, but was removed by Mary 9 days later. Mary was Catholic and reversed many of Edward's changes, but Elizabeth later restored them when she became queen. In his plan for who would take after him, if he didn't have any children, Edward VI initially wanted only men from Lady Jane Grey's family to be able to become rulers. These men could be from her mother, Frances Grey, Duchess of Suffolk, or her sisters, Catherine and Mary. As his death got closer, influenced possibly by Northumberland, he changed his words to allow Jane and her sisters themselves to become rulers. However, he made it clear that he was an exception to his male-only rule, intended only for situations where there were no male heirs, and it shouldn't be a regular practice if Jane and her sisters only had daughters. In the final version of his will, Edward excluded his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth from becoming rulers because they had been declared illegitimate by their father, Henry VIII, and were never made legitimate again. Edward took active steps to make sure his plans were followed. In early June, he worked closely with lawyers to write a clear, final version of his will, which he signed in several places. On the 15th of June, he ordered top judges from his sickbed using stern words and expressions to make his will official and planned to make it approved by Parliament. He also had leading council members and lawyers sign an agreement to follow his will after he passed away. However, when some legal experts voiced concerns about his will, Northumberland angrily threatened them. Eventually, on the 21st of June, over 100 important people, including council members and church leaders, signed Edward's will. Many later said they were pressured into signing by Northumberland, though at the time few showed any hesitation. As Edward VI's health worsened, it became well known that he was dying. Foreign diplomats noticed that plans were being made to prevent his half-sister Mary from becoming queen. France, unhappy with the idea of the emperor's cousin taking the English throne, held secret talks with the Duke of Northumberland and showed their support for an alternative. Although most English people supported Mary, diplomats believed that Lady Jane Grey could still be successfully installed as queen. For a long time, many thought that the Duke of Northumberland alone had plotted to change the line of succession. However, since the 1970s, historians have increasingly seen King Edward himself as initiating this change and strongly pushing for it. Historians have highlighted Edward's vision of creating a Protestant kingdom, while others have emphasized that Edward, despite having some helpers, was the main force behind the move. It's also suspected that Northumberland's close associate, Sir John Gates, might have encouraged Edward to adjust his plans so that Lady Jane Grey could inherit the crown directly. Edward believed he had the ultimate authority and strongly supported removing his half-sisters from the line of succession, particularly Mary. Edward's health began to decline in January 1553 with a fever and a persistent cough. According to reports, the imperial ambassador, Edward suffered greatly during fevers, especially from breathing difficulties caused by pressure on his organs. In early April, Edward felt well enough to go outside in the park at Westminster and later moved to Greenwich. His condition seemed to improve by the 7th of May, with doctors being optimistic about his recovery. He even enjoyed watching ships on the Thames from his window. However, his health took a turn for the worse again, and by the 11th of June, it is reported that Edward was coughing up greenish yellow, black and pink substances, indicating severe lung issues. Doctors then diagnosed him with a life-threatening lung tumour. Edward's condition deteriorated rapidly, his legs swelled, and he became too weak to fight the disease. In his final moments he told the tutor, "I am glad to die." Edward VI made his last public appearance on the 1st of July, when he was seen at the window at Greenwich Palace. Those who saw him were shocked by how thin and frail that he looked, and for the next 2 days large crowds gathered, hoping to see the king again, but on the 3rd of July they were told it was too cold for him to appear. Edward passed away at the age of 15 at Greenwich Palace at 8 p.m. on the 6th of July 1553. According to the story told by John Fox, Edward's final words were, "I am faint. Lord, have mercy upon me, and take my spirit." Edward was buried in the Henry VII Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey on the 8th of August 1553. The funeral featured reformed religious practices led by Thomas Cranmer. The procession included many children in choir robes and was witnessed by many Londoners who were crying in mourning. Edward's funeral chariot, covered in gold fabric, displayed an effigy of the young king, complete with a crown, sceptre, and the Order of the Garter. Edward's grave remained unmarked until 1966, when Christ Hospital School placed a stone in the chapel floor with an inscription to remember their founder. The exact cause of Edward VI's death remains uncertain, although there were rumours of poisoning. There is no evidence to support this. Some believe the Duke of Northumberland, who was very unpopular, might have orchestrated such a plot, while others thought Catholics could have poisoned Edward to bring Mary to the throne. However, the surgeon who examined Edward afterwards concluded that he died of lung disease. The Venetian ambassador noted that Edward had died of consumption, now known as tuberculosis, a diagnosis accepted by many historians. It is believed that Edward's prior illnesses, like measles and smallpox, had weakened his immunity, making him more susceptible to tuberculosis. Another historian suggests his symptoms were more like those of severe pneumonia, which led to a fatal lung infection, blood poisoning, and kidney failure. The death of Henry Fitzroy. One of the biggest events during the Tudor period was King Henry VIII's desperate search for a male heir. His determination to have a son led him down a grim path that included executions, imprisonments, and killings. Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, was beheaded in the Tower of London because she didn't provide a male heir, which angered the king greatly. Henry VIII did father several sons before his heir, Edward VI, was born. During his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon, they had a son who sadly died of illness at about 2 months old. Henry also had an illegitimate son named Henry Fitzroy with Elizabeth Bessie Blount, one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting. King Henry VIII had an affair with Bessie Blount while he was still married to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. At that time, it wasn't uncommon for kings to have mistresses. Henry Fitzroy, the child born from this affair, was given the name Fitzroy, meaning son of the king, a name usually given to the illegitimate children of monarchs. Interestingly, Bessie became pregnant around the same time as Catherine was due to give birth. Henry was romantically involved with some of Catherine's closest companions, including Bessie, who was a beautiful woman and talented dancer, and she was often seen at court. To avoid any issues during the pregnancy of Catherine, Bessie was sent away to give birth quietly. When the baby was born, King Henry was thrilled. Even though the child was illegitimate, he still visited and recognized him as his son on several occasions. To keep peace with the Queen, Bessie did not return to court after the birth. It was undoubtedly painful for Queen Catherine to learn that her husband had been unfaithful with one of her own ladies, and that the affair had resulted in a son, something that the court greatly valued and Catherine had struggled to provide. Henry VIII thought about making Fitzroy his successor, a surprising move since Fitzroy was born out of wedlock. Unfortunately, Fitzroy's life was short and tragic, as he died very young. King Henry's affair with Bessie and Fitzroy's birth were a significant blow to Queen Catherine. This event, among others, led to her downfall, as Henry continued to seek a new wife who would provide a male heir. This quest led him to marry Anne Boleyn. Unlike other kings, Henry VIII did not hide his illegitimate son, but instead he introduced him at court and gave him a great upbringing alongside his legitimate children and other royal children. Henry Fitzroy was part of the royal nursery and attended court many times. King Henry VIII often visited him there. Fitzroy had his own household at the age of 6. He was made a knight and even given the titles of Duke of Richmond and Somerset and Earl of Nottingham. These titles were granted during a large ceremony, making him very special for an illegitimate child. It was the first time in about 400 years that such an event had occurred. The ceremony showed that King Henry had big plans for Fitzroy, possibly even considering him as his heir, which would have affected his daughter Mary's position in line for the throne. Fitzroy was raised like a royal prince and was known for his good looks and manners, resembling his father very closely. Henry even made him the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland and considered making him the King of Ireland at one point. There was also talk about marrying him to his half-sister, Princess Mary, to strengthen his claim to the throne. However, this idea was stopped by Henry's second wife, Anne Boleyn, and eventually at 14 Fitzroy married Mary Howard, a high-status lady related to Anne Boleyn. This marriage was meant to support the royal connections, but was never consummated. Despite his upbringing and preparation for a potential king, Fitzroy witnessed Anne Boleyn's execution, and his life was cut short by illness. He died at the age of 17 in St. James's Palace, believed to have suffered from tuberculosis, a serious condition during the Tudor period. There is speculation that his death might have been caused by a genetic condition affecting the Tudor family, similar to what is believed to have killed Henry VIII's brother Arthur. Some historians also think that he might have caught the plague. In England, Henry Fitzroy was buried quickly, which was common practice to prevent the spread of diseases and protect others. He died from lung problems at the age of 17, and when King Henry VIII learned about his illegitimate son's death, he was devastated. He asked the Duke of Norfolk to organise the funeral, and Fitzroy was buried in an elaborate tomb in Framlingham Church, where he lies next to his wife, who was buried there after her own death years later. Fitzroy's tomb features a combination of royal and religious symbols. It includes his personal coat of arms, the collar from the Order of the Garter, and the Howard family's coat of arms due to his marriage to Mary Howard. The tomb also displays scenes from the Old Testament, mainly from the books of Genesis and Exodus. On one side, the carvings show the creation of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and their temptation and their expulsion from paradise. Another side shows Cain and Abel as babies, Adam working on the land, and Cain's murder of Abel. Another side depicts Noah's Ark during the flood, Noah's drunkenness, the prophet Abraham with angels, and Lot fleeing Sodom and Gomorrah. The final side includes Abraham and his son Isaac, Moses with the tablets of the law, Israelites worshipping the golden calf. One of the engravings on the tomb indicates a small door, which was a private entrance used by noblemen from the castle. Fitzroy's father, Henry VIII, outlived him by just over a decade and was succeeded by his legitimate son, Edward VI, who was born shortly after Fitzroy's death. Some believe that if Fitzroy had lived and Henry VIII had no legitimate sons, Fitzroy might have become King Henry IX because of his father's great affection for him and his power to elevate him. Fitzroy's wife, Mary Howard, died in December 1557, and she was buried with him. Fitzroy's early death likely had a big impact on history. Many people believe that King Henry VIII was preparing him to be a king. If Fitzroy had lived, it's possible that Henry might have stopped at only 2 wives. Like his uncle Arthur Tudor, who also died young, Fitzroy's death significantly affected the course of history. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and leave your comments below.